Oops. Oh, why did that do that? There we go. And that's not good. And that's even worse. That doesn't even show the whole screen. Heck with that, we'll just go. See, now I'm running the through this into the computer, out to the projector. So I don't know what's going on. So we'll just go through it this way. This will be good enough. All right. So to begin with, the history of computers goes back to calculating machines, because that's what a computer was, to compute. Okay, that's the name computer. Matter of fact, if you would look in a dictionary, I'm not sure if it's actually in a dictionary, but if you look 200 years ago, the word computer would have applied to a person, one who computes, okay, for a living, like a mathematician or an accountant or somebody like that who does calculations. Before computers, before calculators, if you take, I used to have an old trick book back here. Maybe one of these old calculus books has it. If you go into the back, yeah, these aren't even old. Shoot. Well, anyway, had an old trig book back here that in the back had trig tables. If you wanted to look up the sine of 60 degrees, you would go to this table, you would go under the column 60 degrees, read over for sine, and you'd have the sine of 60 degrees. Now, obviously, that's one you probably memorized, but if you wanted to do 62 degrees, 62.5 degrees, right, you'd look this up in a table, and there it would be. Well, someone had to come up with those computations that were in that table. And hundreds and hundreds of years ago, those calculations were all done by hand, and they were put into tables, and then mathematicians and scientists, back to the Galileo days and places, people like that, they would use these tables with these numbers in them, and all the calculations were done by hand.
So it's like those multiplication tables you used to have.
Yeah, all those kind of printed kind of tables that are worked out for you as aids to calculating, right? Those came along, and they were replaced because people were always looking for an easier way. I mean, what's a better way that we can do this thing? And there's old saying, necessity is the mother of invention, right? If you need something, if something's a real pain to do, somebody's going to come up with a way to make it easy, all right? And that's where most inventions come from. And so that's what happened with this. So when we talk about the very first calculating machines that were around, it was the abacus, 3000 BC. I mean, it's been around a long time, 5,000 years. Now, the beads have to do with numbers and place value, and their location in the different places has to do with like decimal places and so forth. This can do adding, subtracting, multiplication, division. Like we've talked about, multiplication is just really repeated addition, and subtraction is really, or division is really based on subtraction. So you could do those basic operations, and people that are really good with these can do calculations, multiplication and addition stuff about as fast as you can type it on your calculator. It's pretty amazing. But I should look. There's probably YouTube videos out there about an abacus and using it. Should probably do that sometime. Maybe I'll look that up if you guys are working here later. Okay. So anyway, you got the abacus. 3000 BC. Okay. Then 1600s. Napier's bones. Now, you don't have to memorize this idea of Napier's bones. I mean, you can go ahead and put it down. Napier's bones, 1617. These were these kind of ivory. They were made out of ivory typically, or some kind of solid material, maybe wood, possibly. The reason they're called bones is because a lot of times they're made from ivory, that kind of a thing. But 1670, and these were used for multiplication. The most important thing about this is notice the timeline, 1600s. Now, what was going on in the 1600s? What time? I mean, come on, history people. What world history? What kind of time period was that? Well, it could have been. I don't know. I'm not a history guy. I mean, wasn't that just past the Middle Ages, and where we get is it like the Renaissance? Was that like a lot of art and a lot of like Galileo and Da Vinci and those kind of people? That was a lot of that was in the 1600s, right? There was a lot of invention and those kind of things. From the 1400s to the 1600s during that time frame, a lot of exploration, Columbus, and that kind of stuff. A lot of scientific kinds of things going on. A lot of explaining that the Earth is not flat, and looking at the stars, and and our place in the universe, and that kind of stuff. So there was a lot of this scientific and mathematical kind of stuff going on. So again, necessity is the mother of invention. There was a need for the ability to calculate. Up until that time, in the early Middle Ages and stuff, it was all farming and land. Everything was land. If you owned land, you were rich, and everything was bartering and trading. And so there wasn't a lot of need for a lot of mathematics in that society. But as you got into the more scientific realm and so forth, and some of these kind of things, now there was a greater need for the ability to calculate and do calculations. And so that's when these things started to come along. So a lot of what you're going to see here is going to be in this time period. So you're not going to have to memorize certain dates, but I want you to know kind of time period. So the next thing, here's this slide rule that I was talking about. And you got 3 different levels with numbers sliding back and forth, and you can do division and addition, subtraction, you can do logarithms, you can do all kinds of stuff on this. Okay? And again, this is the 1600s, and like I said, it was used until the 1970s, back in the 60s during the space program. Those engineers had all grown up using this kind of thing for calculations, and they could do them. They could work them very, very quickly. And you would learn it in high school. I just came along just late enough that I never used a slide rule. I mean, we could buy handheld calculators. Now, they were fairly expensive, but by the late 70s, $40. I mean, I say expensive. You guys in calculus are buying these $150 calculators. So, I mean, look what this can do. I mean, the amount of memory and the stuff that calculator can do using calculus is more memory than they had on those when Neil Armstrong went to the moon. That spaceship, that capsule and stuff they were in, didn't have near the memory, not even close, that calculator has right there. So it is worth, I suppose, a little more money. But anyway, this is just another way of doing calculations. So those came along then. Here's another one, Pascal. He's important just because he's an important mathematician. Pascal's calculating machine, 1642. The only thing I want you to know about these things is like on a true, false, or multiple choice, that you kind of understand the time period that these things came about. Okay? And that's what will be important. Okay, so Pascal, he's another one that's in the 1600s. His father was an accountant, and he had to do, I mean, he was only in his teenage years when he came up with this. And it kind of works like the odometer on your car. You can't really see it, but it's got some wheels. And just with like a pencil or whatever, you could add up numbers. You could dial in at 23, and then these things would turn over. So just like in your odometer, it would just kind of keep track, kind of like keeping a running total. Okay? And so that's kind of what that was used for. Okay? Here's another one, Leibniz. This machine has a kind of a drum cylinder. Again, those things aren't necessarily important for you to write down, but it's got a crank here, and it was a little more complex than Pascal's. It could do some multiplying and some things like that. But again, and what's important is some of these names. Leibniz, Gottfried Wilhelm von Leibniz was the guy's name. He's credited with kind of the discovery and the putting together the ideas that became calculus. Isaac Newton and Leibniz are the ones that are really responsible for calculus. Okay, so let me try to get the right guy. And so that's kind of what's important about that one. All right, so those were some of the things in the 1600s, these calculating devices that would help us do calculations more easily. Okay, then we jump to the 1800s. So nothing really new happens until the 1800s. Now, Jacquard's loom. It's 1801. Okay. Now, this was not even a machine that did calculations, which is really makes it kind of important in the whole history here, because a loom is something that they used to weave cloth, and you had to be a person had to be pretty skilled to be able to run this machine to weave the intricate patterns that might be involved in this particular design that they wanted to do. And what he did is, and I don't know a lot about him other than just some of what I read, but it was a series of rods going up and down that would take the yarn, the cloth, the string, whatever, and it would, and you would work it with foot pedals and hands in your hands and get it to weave in a certain way. And what he did is he developed these series. What you can see down here is a series of metal plates with holes in them. And so what he did is what the person running the loom would do is with their feet and their hands is they would control which rods went up and down at which times. Well, what he did is by putting holes in there, you could just let all the rods go up and down, but only certain ones would go through depending if there was a hole or not. So what they could do is they could plan out ahead of time which rods are supposed to go up and down at which times, and they could punch holes in these metal plates, and then they could just run these metal plates through. As the rods go up and down, they would go in the right pattern and create the thing. And now you didn't even need to have a skilled person run it. Just needed some way to get the thing to go up and down, and then they could repeat that pattern over and over again, and you can see how that kind of compares to programming. That kind of compares to computer. So even though it didn't do any calculations or anything, it was the first one that used this idea of essentially storing on these metal plates, with these holes, how it would go up and down. It was basically giving instructions for how to do it. So in a sense, that's your kind of your first program, which is still the idea in use today, and was then borrowed and used for computers later on. So it's a big kind of important idea in the history. Okay, and then so that's in the 1800s. Then later in the 1800s was a guy named Babbage. Now this guy's really important. I mean, you want to put a big asterisk by this guy, Charles Babbage. He was from England, and he's often considered the father of computers. Okay, he's kind of the first guy who put together the idea, taking Jacquard's idea of the punch cards. And he's really the first one that had this idea of input, process, output, storage, okay? He developed two machines. One was called the difference engine, which he never did finish, because most of Babbage's ideas were ahead of its time, and he could never get the parts. And now this didn't run on electricity, okay? This is just all gears and machinery. Later, he developed something called the analytical engine. Could store numbers. You don't need to write all this different stuff down, but could store numbers, use punch cards. That might be something to put down there. It used the punch card idea from Jacquard. It was steam powered. But again, it was just for calculating, large calculations, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, that kind of thing. He was never real successful at getting it running. His design, though, was in later years, as they were able to machine the finer parts that it needed and so forth to make it work. But he kind of is the original guy who had the idea. And it's kind of a whole thing about English royalty, and he had to kind of suck up to the king and the queen to get money, to be able to do this. Again, this was during that, in that time period of a lot of kind of invention and discovery and those kind of things. There was a lady that worked with him named Ada Lovelace. She won't be on the thing, but she's often considered kind of one of the first programs. She's the one that gave him the idea of using the binary number system, zeros and ones. Now we're going to talk about the binary number system here in a little bit, but the zeros and ones works really well for computers because they run electricity. Like circuits are either on or they're off, and so that's how the computer does mathematics, is with binary numbers. Binary bi means 2. The binary number system only has 2 digits in it, 0 and 1. We use a decimal number system most of the time. It's got 10 digits, 0 through 9. All of our numbers can be made with the digits 0 through 9. In the binary number system, we can make all the numbers using only a 0 and a 1. And we're going to talk about that here in a minute. She's the one that had that idea because he used magnetics. So magnetics have, a polarity, like a plus or a minus, right? And so that idea of a 0, 1. So she was the first one. She was a mathematician, and she's the one who kind of came up with the idea of using the 0, 1 thing for, well, same with the punch card. Punch card either has a hole or doesn't have a hole, right? So if it's got a hole, it's like a 1. If it doesn't have a hole, it's a 0, or vice versa. I'm not sure which way they did that. Okay, so the binary number system was very important for how these things work. Okay, last thing in the 1800s, this guy named Herman Hollerith. Now this is the first one that was in America. Jacquard was a Frenchman, I think. Not necessarily important, but Jacquard was French, and Babbage was English. Hollerith was in America. Okay, now a couple things that would be important to write down about Hollerith. Herman Hollerith was his name. He worked for the U.S. Census. Right? Everybody's familiar with the census. Every 10 years, right? They try to count how many people are in the U.S. and they send it. Now they send out mailings, and you got to fill out, and, how many kids you have, how much money you make. They collect a lot of data about where people live and amount of income and all kinds of data that they need. Now, what's the number one reason, or one of the main reasons, again, little history here now, that we have the census? Why, back in the Founding Fathers, why did they say every 10 years we want to count how many people are? Why is it important? Why was it important back in the constitutional days to count how many people are? For what? Taxes. Yeah, sorta. What else? Come on, we got election. We got big election coming up in November, right? Right? What's well, not only for voting, but Congress. There's 435 people in Congress, right? The House of Representatives. Yeah. How many representatives does Nebraska have? 3. Why do we only have 3? Because of our population. If we had more people, we'd get more. Now, Iowa just lost one, right? Iowa had, I don't know how many Iowa has, 7, maybe 8, I don't know how many representatives they have. They lost one based on this last census. Okay? 2 of their sitting representatives are running against each other because they're now in the same district, right? So, because some places have gained population, they get more representatives. So that's one reason, very important, right? We need to know who lives where, what states have how many for representation in Congress. So that's one very big reason. But there's all kinds of things that they use the census data for. Now, what was going on? And now, of course, you think back in those days, I mean, literally, they were going around counting people by hand, right? They were going around with paper and pencil, and they were getting this information. But, I had the 13 colonies there. Wasn't too hard to do. What's going on in the 1880s in America?
This is right after the Civil War. So
Yeah, after the Civil War. What happened in 1849? The gold rush, right? The 49ers, right? San Francisco 49ers, that's why they're called the 49ers. The 49ers are those people who are heading to California for the gold, right? Oregon Trail, right? Pioneers. I mean, that's what's going on in the late 1800s, right? People going west, right? We got the Pony Express, right? How long did it take to get a piece of mail from New York to Los Angeles? Days, weeks, month, whatever, right? By Pony Express or wagon train or whatever. So they're going to count all the people, and they're going to get all that information, and we're spread out now all across the country. How long do you think it takes to do that? Long time. In the I'm not sure which of the years here, 1870 census, let's go with that. It was one of those, 1870, 1880, right in that range. Took 8 years to gather all the data from the 1870 census. And then by the time they start putting it together and so forth, right? I mean, it's time to do the next one. And guess what? By then, the population had grown. We also had, there wasn't a ton of immigration yet, but it was starting, right? Coming across Statue of Liberty, the whole thing, right? That was more in the early 1900s probably, but we were getting close, and the population was really growing. And so the next year's census was going to probably take even longer. At the rate we were going, it was going to take more than 10 years. Well, that's a problem, right? If it takes more than 10 years to get your census data, number one, it's not very accurate. Number two, you're already starting the next one. So it's a big problem. So Hollerith worked for the Census Bureau, and he developed this tabulating machine where they could have people enter the data onto these punch cards, and then this machine could read these cards and read and tally that information and total it and sort it and do these things much, much faster. The next census, the one before, taking like 7 to 8 years. The very next census using his machine took 3 years, with way more people spread out more, and it was able to cut that down quite drastically. Okay, so that was very important. Another important thing, a side note about Hollerith, is after he developed this machine, he patented it. He left the Census Bureau and started his own company. He said, hey, Census Bureau, I own the patent to this. If you want to use it, you got to pay me big money. Well, they said the heck with that, and they got one of his lieutenant, his kind of assistant, to develop a similar machine. But he had the patent to this machine, so he went off, started his own company, and that company later became International Business Machines, IBM. Okay, so this started with working with the Census Bureau, coming with his time machine, he developed IBM. And IBM was known for a long time for just office machinery, okay? And they still are to this day. They got into the computer business for a while. They don't do so much with computers anymore, but they were kind of big. Matter of fact, that was how Microsoft got their start. Microsoft wrote the operating system for IBM's first personal computer. That's how Bill Gates and his guys got started. They got to write the operating system for IBM, and the IBM PC, because IBM was such a big company, so many businesses bought the IBM computers in the early days that Microsoft grew huge because everybody was using they owned the software. And that's how Microsoft really got big, was because of their connection with IBM. Okay, so that's the 1800s. The 1800s, now we start getting the ideas of computers. So what do you got? You got calculating devices in the 1600s, just to do calculations. Okay, mechanical devices. In the 1800s, you got machines starting to take on the look of this kind of computerized thing with the punch cards, kind of the programming thing. But again, just to do calculations is the main thing. Okay, so then we jump to the 1940s. Now, what's going on in the 1940s?
Just
World War II. Without World War II, computers would not have been developed nearly as fast as they are. Again, necessity is the mother of invention. During the war, there was a great need for calculation of firing tables, angles and trajectories for firing guns and cannons and stuff like that. So the government poured tons of money into universities. This one was created at the University of Pennsylvania. But without that government money to the universities to develop and study and to research these ideas, the computer would not have developed nearly at the rate that it did. Okay, it's really because of World War II that computers got on the kind of the fast track and to have what we have today. Now, we'd eventually gotten there, but it wouldn't have been the same. The ENIAC was the first fully electronic digital computer. Now, you can read about history of computer and you can hear about all other kinds of computers. In America, we call this one the first one. There are people over in England and whatever that say there were others that were before us. Because people all around the world were, working on this kind of thing. But in America, we like to think we were first. Okay? So we would say that this was first. Now, you can see by this picture, it takes up an entire room. It's got these big, these big reel-to-reel tapes, on these machines. That's where the stuff was stored. These are magnetic. Again, just like Babbage's idea of the magnetic. Okay. University of Pennsylvania weighed 30 tons, had 18,000 vacuum tubes. Yeah, I need to get out some of my stuff here. Oh, here's punch cards. Just pass that page around. Punch card, okay, we were just talking about. Okay, here's a vacuum tube, circuit board with vacuum tubes attached to it. Okay, this machine had 18,000 of those. Okay, so you can kind of pass those around and take a look at them. Cost 487,000, which I'm guessing in today's dollars would be, I don't know how many, 100 million or whatever, 50 million or whatever the thing would be now. But that was how the electricity, that's how the electricity was turned on and off, almost like little light bulbs, those tubes at the top there. Okay? Now the problem with those, and well, here, let me go on here a little bit and I'll come back to vacuum tubes. You don't have to write anything about this. This isn't on the test. Grace Hopper, though, she's kind of famous as one of the first programmers. The UNIVAC was, again, the same situation. The University of Pennsylvania, they created the ENIAC. Those guys that created that, then they patented it, and then they went off to make their millions. They went off and built their own, a company, and they built the UNIVAC, which was basically the next version of the ENIAC. And the first one they sold was to the government, to the U.S. Census Bureau, to do census data. Okay, so that was a UNIVAC, and she was instrumental in that. Remember how we talked about computer bugs, right? You got a bug in your computer? Well, literally, that comes from a bug in the computer. This is supposedly, Grace Hopper found a moth stuck in a relay responsible for a malfunction. So it says first actual case of a bug being found, and it's like this moth on this piece of paper. And so that's where the terminology came from. If your program's not working, it's got a bug. It's got a bug in it. So anyway, vacuum tubes. Okay, so now this last stretch here, we're going to get into, in your notes, kind of the generations of computers. So first generation would be vacuum tubes. Okay, so in your notes you want to go like first generation, second generation, so forth. First generation would be vacuum tubes. Okay, and so did you guys ever see that? Where's that? Vacuum tube. You got that? Okay, so first generation would be, the circuitry here, like this. Those cards, on these cards here, the year before I went to University of Nebraska, they did all their programming on punch cards. So you would have a stack of these cards. You would sit down at a machine that looked like a typewriter. You would stick the stack of cards in there. One would shoot over to the middle. You would type. Every card was one line of code. So you would type, print hello world. Hit enter, and that card would shoot over, and the next card would come in. You would type your next line, and it would go. Right? What happens if you're like, oh crap, I forgot a line. I need to stick a line in between. Well, you would get a card, you would type that card, and then you'd have to take that card and you'd have to stick it in the stack in the line you wanted. Now it had a printer tape like a typewriter did, and it would print up at the top of the card. It would print what you did, so like it would say print hello world, and ink would be up here. So you could actually see what you would type in that card. And it would punch these holes out. It would punch holes out where these numbers are. Okay? And so it would and so when your program is done, your program was a stack of cards. And to run your program, you'd have to go over to the card reader. You'd stick the stack of cards in there, and then hit a button, and it'd run all the cards through, send it to the main computer, it would run it, and then would print it out in the back room somewhere on this big paper, and then you'd go up to this window, and there was somebody working back there, and they would be pulling off these printouts as they came, and they would stick them in this box, in this bin, and you would go in there and you'd go through and find yours, and then you'd see if your program ran. You'd see if it worked. And if it didn't work, it says syntax error in line 70, and you'd go back and you'd take your stack of cards and you'd find line 70, and oh crap, I spelled that wrong. Then you'd sit down and you'd type a new card, and stick, I mean, it was a deal. So you could not, you wouldn't have been able to do user input. So let me think, how would that have even, how would you have done user input? Well, there wouldn't have been a lot of interaction. There wouldn't have been a lot of that user input. Now, I know how this worked because I went on a field trip there my senior year and saw this all in action. When I went there the next year as a freshman, they had gotten rid of the card readers and went to terminals that looked a lot like personal computers, but they weren't actual computers. They were just tied into the main computer. So when we typed and ran our programs, they would shoot it off to the main computer, run it, and come back to our screen. So it felt the same as what you did. Difference was it wasn't like Macintosh. It wasn't pull-down menus and stuff like that. It was all just text-based. It was just a black screen with green writing on it. It was just text-based. But you could do user input and stuff like that. But the big pain was they only had like one card reader. So there'd be like, they'd have like 10 punch card stations. So there'd be 10 people that are sitting there working. You'd go over to the card reader and you might have to wait in line for somebody else doing theirs, you know. And usually you had to wait in line to get one of the card punch things. There were many nights where I had a program to do. Well, and this was true when I got there. It wasn't the punch card machines anymore, but it was the terminals, and they might only have 15 machines out like this room, and there were hundreds of kids in computer classes, you know. So I'd go, and they only had it in this one room at the whole university, and I would go to work on my program, and they were all full, and there was a line of about 10 people in the hallway. So you could sit there in the hallway in line, doing other homework at 2 in the morning, because that was about the best time to go get one, you know. But there, you know, that, to be honest, it's kind of amazing. I mean, I went to be a computer programmer. That was my first goal, my first thing I wanted to do. Even though I'd always wanted to be a teacher, I decided I'd make more money doing programming. So I went and did that. And after one semester, I said, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to be a teacher. And part of it was because I hated sitting there at 2 in the morning to write my dumb program. If it would have been like now, where I could have been in my laptop in my dorm room, writing my programs, who knows? You know, I don't know. I don't know if that would have made a difference. But I just hated it. It was awful. I mean, I spent so much time sitting in the hallway waiting for one of those machines to open up. And because what would happen is somebody's writing their program. You know how long you can sit there in front of your machine, write your program, and run it, and it doesn't work, and run it. I mean, so those machines would be used, and I'm 10th in line. It might be 3 hours before one of those opens up. You know what I mean? I mean, they're working on their program, and if I leave, then I lost my place in line. It was not a lot of fun. So anyway, the good old days. So those are vacuum tubes. Now, vacuum tubes got really hot. They just like a light bulb. I mean, they had electricity running through, and so they overheated, and they had to be in specially cooled rooms. And I mean, it just was just kind of a nightmare. They were constantly breaking down. Constantly. And mostly the machines that did this just did math, just simple arithmetic and adding and multiplying. That's all it was doing. All right, second generation, transistors. Okay, the transistor circuit board. So now you compare a vacuum tube circuit board to a transistor circuit board. Okay, and you can just see there's just so many more circuits on this. There's many more circuits on this than there is on this. Okay. Okay, this came out in the 50s. I would say this would be the 50s to the 60s. Okay, the 40s to the 50s. Now, the transistor was developed in 1948, but it never really came into use until into the 50s. Okay, there's always a lag between when something's first discovered and then to make it profitable and mass produce it so that it can be used more widely. So as you get into the 50s and 60s, you get into transistors. Now, the thing about transistors is they use much less heat. Oops. Okay, so the vacuum tubes are gone, and now we've got transistors. Now, hundreds of transistors, or excuse me, hundreds of vacuum tubes could be replaced by one transistor. And so what's that mean? The computers are going to get what? Smaller and cheaper and faster, right? Which, of course, is still true to this day, right? They just announced the iPhone 5 yesterday, right? Now, it didn't get smaller. It actually got a little bigger, but the screen got bigger, but it's thinner, right? It's actually got less volume than the old iPhone, but it has longer battery life, right? It's not really cheaper anymore. They pretty much keep the price about the same, but it's faster, right? It's got a new processor, so it's like twice as fast as the old iPhone and so forth. I mean, so even to this day, that's what continues to happen. So you got transistors. So that was kind of second generation. That gets into the 50s and 60s. You ever hear of a transistor radio? That was a big deal because in the 40s and before then, radios had vacuum tubes, right? And that's why radios were like this big. I mean, before people had TVs, they used to sit in their homes and listen to the radio. And they had big radios, and they were like this big, you know. You couldn't really carry around your music, right, if you wanted to listen to a radio station. But in the 50s and 60s, mostly the 60s, you started getting these pocket radios people could carry around, listen to radio stations, listen to music. It was a big deal, right? I mean, you think about you guys and iPods and your music today. I mean, it's a big deal. It was a big deal back then to people our age, you're my age, to be able to listen to their music, be able to carry it around with it. It was a big deal. And the transistor allowed that to happen because we could make these radios could be small, but also for computers, same thing. All right, the third generation, integrated circuits. Now these pictures I'm showing you, these are some of the very first, invented. But this allowed them to put transistors, resistors, capacitors. We're not going to get into all that electronics, but to all be integrated onto a single chip. Okay, so this is your third generation, and so now we're talking about getting into the 70s, late 60s, getting into the 70s. Okay, and so now here's an integrated circuit board. Okay, and each one of those black chips, each one of those black integrated circuits has the equivalent of thousands and thousands of transistors. So again, we're able to make it much, much smaller and more powerful and generate less heat, right, and all those things. Okay, so first generation vacuum tube, second generation transistors, third generation integrated circuits. Okay, third generation. So kind of into the 70s, getting smaller, getting cheaper. Not much to know about that. Okay. Now don't write any of this down here. Don't worry about any of this stuff here. But microprocessor, 2,250 transistors. This one little chip right here like this, 2,250 transistors, which replaced, all 18,000 of those vacuum tubes in that first ENIAC that took up a whole room. And now they're just these very, very small things. So you might write down fourth generation. So very large scale integrated circuit, all these, the Pentium 4, which came out in the mid-90s or late 90s, maybe around 2000, 42 million transistors. So that tells you anything. So fourth generation would be kind of up really till now. Microchips, everything getting smaller. I mean, putting more and more circuits, more and more chips on a circuit board. And I'll just read that. I'm sorry. Yeah. And really, you think about it, there hasn't been that much advancement. I mean, that's like 40 years. All those other ones were like 10, 15-year periods until we had some new development. Really, all we've been doing is using the same silicon-based chips, just getting them smaller, packing more and more in a tighter space. Of course, the biggest problem the engineers have is heat, because you pack more and more of that with electricity going through it. It generates, because of friction, it generates heat. And then that runs down battery life, and it they burn out and so forth. And so that's the biggest problem they have when they come up with new laptops and iPads and iPods and stuff like that. Okay, we're getting closer. I know, Jordan, you're going to have to leave pretty soon, right?
Oh,
Okay, so whenever you have to leave, hopefully my thing's still recording here. All right, now we start getting into the 70s. Okay, so we had first generation, second, third, fourth. Okay, so we're kind of done with the generations. The last thing we'll talk about is a personal computer. Okay, last thing we're talking about is a personal computer. Now, you don't need to write down, really, to be honest, any of these names. I don't care if you write down any of this stuff right here now. Other than in the mid to late 70s is when the personal computers came into being. Just understand that in the mid to late 70s is when we started getting personal computers. And that would be in your fourth generation, your microchips, you know. Because we could make them small enough, we started getting into these ideas of personal computers. And that's when the Steve Jobs of the world and people like this came along. This is just some information. Don't write any of this down, but 256 bytes of memory. That's bytes. Remember, a byte is a character. 256 characters of memory. It was just a box with flashing lights, really. You know, and you could get it, a kit to build yourself for $400 or $500 and be assembled for you. Apple computers came around in the 70s. Now, this is actually a Mac that came out in 1984. And the Mac was the first one that had the mouse and the user interface, you know, with the pull-down menus and stuff like that. Before then, everything was just text-based on the screen. Okay? IBM, when IBM jumped in, they were a big company. When they jumped in, see, they didn't want to jump in the beginning and do personal computers. They didn't think there was any money there. They couldn't believe anybody wanted one of these in their house. Right? Who in the world, why does somebody need to do this to keep track of their daily budget and, you know, whatever? I mean, they just couldn't be. Business, yeah, they sold the big mainframes to business, but they just couldn't believe people wanted these. Well, after about 3-4 years of kind of, you know, people kind of wanting them and buying the apples and stuff like that, they decided, what the heck. And it was just kind of a little side business for them. They didn't really care much about it. That's why they let Bill Gates, that's why they, instead of developing their own software for it, they just paid Bill Gates and gave him license to do the software for it. Well, it was a bad decision for IBM, and it was a great decision for Bill Gates because he became the world's richest guy because of it. And Microsoft became such a huge company because of that decision right there. Okay? This was one of the first personal computers I ever worked on. A buddy of mine, this is right when I graduated from high school. A buddy of mine, when I was my roommate, my second year in college, bought one of these. And so we had that. I spent one spring break writing a 25-page paper on a machine that looked very much like that right there. Okay, from some dumb class. 25 pages. That was our whole grade. It was called Small Group Communication or something. Some communication class I had to take. Small group communication. And the whole grade in the class was a 25-page paper and your presentation of the paper. You had to join a small group of some kind, and then you had to write about the communication and how the interactions within the small group and whatever. It was a pain. But anyway, I hated every minute. That's why I spent one spring break doing it. What's that? Don't take that class. No kid. So anyway, but that, oops. All right. So the IBM personal computer, and then again, don't write this down. But this is just kind of look at. I mean, right now we're to the Intel Core type of chips, and look at the memory, 512K back in the day, all the way to 32 gigabytes in the processor, processing speed, the change from floppy drives to flash drives that we have now, big whole room kind of computers all the way down to laptops and iPhones and stuff. The first UNIVAC cost $1.6 million. I think that's in today's money. And then, you know, the prices, of course, the prices have kind of stabilized a little bit. Okay? So what's happened? Greater increases in speed, storage, memory, networking. Of course, the internet obviously has been huge. Flash memory, we got cell phones now. Wireless has been a big thing coming in. Good luck today, Jordan.
Thanks for the cookies.
Yeah, you're so welcome. And so then, you know, what's going to happen 2 years from now, 20 years from now? I mean, it just, and what's funny is I've been asking that same question, in this computer math class for 15 years. And who'd have thought 15 years ago, and 15 years ago was before the iPod, obviously the iPhone. I mean, cell phones in general. I mean, really, cell phone, in the late 90s, the internet was just kind of going. Cell phones were like this. People had bag phones in their cars. Like my dad worked out on the road, so he had this phone in his car. And I always thought that was cool that you have a phone in your car, but it was in a bag and it looked like just your regular phone at home, but in a car. That's something you'd carry around. And I remember a buddy of mine who sold cars, and he had one about this tall, big kind of brick shaped, phone that he carried around. I thought that was pretty cool. And here we were doing our programming and all that stuff, and we talked about all these things, but it's just amazing. What was it when the iPod came out? About 2000, 2001, 2002, somewhere right around in that time. The first iPod came out, and so 10 years ago. And they haven't changed a whole lot. Well, they've changed quite a bit. The touch screen and like the iPhone and everything. So anyway, that's kind of your basic history. Now I jumped over a few things here. We talked about floppy disks. Here, pass a couple of those things around. I used to have this hang up in the room. I used to hang this up in the classroom. Floppy disk guy, be careful, always hold the disk, let it jack it out. There's that great big one. I thought I had a smaller. Here's my neat little thing I used to have. So there to keep track of my. Let me see what I got here. Apple Works. That was kind of like a Microsoft Office. There we go. There's a disk. Mr. Clark, basic. Has basic programming stuff in it, sort of. Don't worry about busting them or anything. They are. But that's the way the computer. Did anybody ever use a computer with something like this? Have you? Okay.
My grandpa still doesn't work anymore.
What's that?
My grandpa still doesn't work.
Still hasn't
that
worked?
first one he showed, not the one you used, it's the one before that.
The Mac, that little Mac, yeah.
He had video games like downloaded on there.
Sure.
We'd sit around like us cousins for like hours.
Yeah, well, it was cool if that was all you had to do. But these were literally floppy, but you had to be careful not to touch the magnetic part there. As it spun around and you keep it in the sleeves or whatever. And so, and then they came out with where's those? These right here. These came out. Now in that Mac, in the early Macs, you had these. And these were a little smaller than this thing, so it was covered up at least. So the magnetic part of it. But this is just a little magnetic disc, just like those, just smaller. And so, but these were a lot nicer because they were, they wouldn't break. Yeah, they're more solid, and so they just were better. And so you would store your data on this. You would put that in, and you would store it on there and pop it out, and carry these around with you or have them with you, and so forth. And then we got to, and then of course once we got into, like the little flash drives and things like that. And of course now with the internet, a lot of stuff just stored online. Stuff's just stored online, and you just don't even have local content or CDs. You can burn a CD, you can burn information onto a CD and stuff. And so pretty soon computers didn't even have these anymore. Those iMacs, like those blue iMacs like that, when those came out in about 98, 99, right around in there. They were the first computers not to have a slot for these. And everyone's like, oh, that's crazy, we gotta have something. You could buy an external one that would plug in, and then you could do it. So a lot of people had those. But then pretty soon people just started, that's when these started coming out, and CD drive, they had the CD drive so you could burn it onto a CD. And so, it just, that's kind of been the evolution of these machines. Well, now you buy laptops that don't even have a slot for the CD in. right? Or DVD. And I think my laptop still does. But like the MacBook Air, I think the MacBook Air doesn't even have a slot for a DVD or anything. You know, you just keep it all. It's stored online and stuff like that. So anyway, it just kind of interesting, kind of the progression of how things have went. All right, I'm not going to talk about the binary numbers now. You guys have been listening long enough. So today I've got a mini program. If you get done somewhere here, mini 11, and you can work on that. Obviously, finish up wages would be a good thing to do. It'd be nice if we get that done today. And if you don't, maybe have a little time next week, but if we get that finished, would be good. Or work on this Mini 11. You got that play computer doing thing. Okay? All right. Here we go. Yes.
Go bug for a minute.
Can you pull up that page you had up yesterday with all the test orders?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Good idea. Okay. There you go.